You hear about Viking executions and you picture quick deaths, sword through the chest, axe to the skull, over in seconds. That is not what happened to Halfdan Long-Leg. His execution took hours. It required surgical precision. It turned his body inside out while he was still breathing. And when they finally pulled his lungs through the opening in his back, creating wings from his own flesh, they offered what was left to Odin. This is not a Hollywood invention. This happened on a tiny island north of Scotland in the late 9th century. The man who ordered it was avenging his father. The method was called the blood eagle, and if you think the stories exaggerate, wait until you hear what modern anatomists discovered when they tested whether this could actually be done. We are going deep into 13th century saga accounts, skaldic poetry from the 1100s, and a 2022 medical study published in Speculum that analyzed every stage of the ritual with surgical software. The team included anatomists from Kiel University in England and a historian of religion from the University of Iceland. They modeled the extreme version. They mapped the tools. They concluded it was anatomically possible, but would kill the victim before completion unless performed with extraordinary care. That precision is what makes it terrifying. If you value documented Viking Age history like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the Orkney saga, a 13th century Icelandic text compiled around 1220 to 1230. Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla from approximately 1230. Roberta Frank's landmark 1984 analysis in the English Historical Review titled Viking Atrocity and Skaldic Verse, published in April 1984. And Murphy Fuller, and Gates' 2022 anatomical study, An Anatomy of the Blood Eagle, published in Speculum Journal of Medieval Studies in January 2022. Now back to the information. Halfdan Long-Leg was not some nobody. He was the son of Harald Fairhair, the first king to unite Norway. Harald ruled after his victory at the Battle of Hafrsfjord in 872. But Harald had a problem. He had many sons. The sagas say dozens, and most of them wanted power. Halfdan's mother was a Sami woman named Snefrithur Svasadóttir. That detail matters because it placed Halfdan lower in the succession hierarchy. He was legitimate, but not from Harald's primary marriage. He was pushed aside after his mother died, so were his brothers. When you are a king's son, with no clear path to a throne, you take what you can. Spring came. Halfdan and his brother Gudrod Ljómi, known as Gudrod Gleam, sailed to Mora in western Norway. Their target was Rognvald Eysteinsson, Earl of Mora. Rognvald was Harald's closest ally. Some sources even suggest they might have been related by blood. Rognvald had been given the earldom of Muras after helping Harald consolidate power. He had cut Harald's hair after 10 years of the king refusing a trim until he controlled all of Norway. That haircut ceremony formalized Harald's dominance. Rognvald was rewarded with land, with influence. Gudrod wanted that title. He wanted the earldom. And if taking it meant killing his father's most trusted lieutenant, so be it. They found Rognvald at a house in Giske, located in Møre og Romsdal. He had about 60 men with him. Halfdan and Gudrod moved fast. They surrounded the building before dawn. Then they set it on fire. The saga accounts are blunt about what happened next. Rognvald and all 60 of his men burned alive inside that house. None escaped. Gudrod immediately claimed the earldom for himself. Halfdan sailed west to Orkney. When Harald Fairhair heard what his sons had done, the sagas say he flew into a rage. This was not just murder. This was the murder of the man who had legitimized Harald's kingship, who had stood beside him through the consolidation wars, who had been given Orkney and Shetland as compensation when his son Ivar died fighting for Harald in Scotland. Harald sent a massive force against Gudrod. Gudrod was overthrown and banished. His fate after that is unknown. The historical record goes silent. But Halfdan had already fled to Orkney. That is where the story turns. Orkney in the late 9th century was contested ground. Harald had granted the islands to Rognvald as compensation for Ivar's death. Rognvald had given them to his brother Sigurd Eysteinsson, who became the first formal Earl of Orkney. Sigurd died in battle. His son Guthorm ruled briefly and died childless. Rognvald then sent his own son Háleggr to govern the islands. Háleggr could not handle Danish raids. He resigned and returned to Norway. The saga says everyone thought that was a huge joke. Then Rognvald offered the position to his youngest son, Torf-Einarr. Torf-Einarr was illegitimate. His mother was a slave, descended from slaves on both sides. Rognvald did not think much of him. The Orkney saga quotes Rognvald telling Torf-Einarr that considering the kind of mother he had, slave-born on each side, he was not likely to make much of a ruler. But Rognvald agreed to provide him with a ship and crew, probably hoping he would leave and never return. Torf-Einarr sailed to Orkney. He fought and defeated 2 Danish warlords, Thorir Treskeg, known as Thorir Treebeard, and Kalf Skurfa, known as Kalf the Scurvy. He established himself as Earl of both Orkney and Shetland. Then his father was murdered. When news reached Orkney that Rognvald had been burned alive with 60 men, Torf-Einarr knew who was responsible. Halfdan had already arrived. He displaced Torf-Einarr and took control of the islands. Halfdan had ships. He had warriors. He had the name of a king's son. But Torf-Einarr had something else. He had fury, and he had local support. From a base in Caithness on the Scottish mainland, just across the Pentland Firth from Orkney, Torf-Einarr resisted. He gathered men. He prepared. Then he struck. The saga accounts describe a battle at sea. The details are sparse, but the outcome is clear. Torf-Einarr won. Halfdan's forces scattered. Then came a ruthless campaign on land. Torf-Einarr hunted the survivors across the islands. He was looking for one man, Halfdan Long-Leg, and he found him on North Ronaldsay. North Ronaldsay is the northernmost island in the Orkney archipelago. It lies about 4 kilometers north of Sanday. The island is flat, low, and exposed. It measures roughly 5 kilometers long. In the late 9th century, it would have offered few places to hide. Torf-Einarr knew the terrain. Halfdan was cornered. The sagas say Torf-Einarr spied Halfdan hiding on the island. He was captured alive. Now comes the execution. The Orkney saga, written in Iceland in the early 13th century, describes what happened next. The text is in Old Norse. The translation reads, "There they found Halfdan Háleggr, and Einar had an eagle carved on his back with a sword, and cut all the ribs from the spine and pulled out a lung, and he gave it to Odin for his victory." Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, written around 1230 Gustas, gives a slightly fuller account. Snorri writes that Torf-Einarr went up to Halfdan and performed the blood eagle by thrusting his sword into the man's backbone, severing all the ribs down to the loins, and then pulling out the lungs. And that was Halfdan's death. These are the only detailed descriptions we have, but they contain specific anatomical steps. First, the victim is placed face down. Second, a blade is thrust into the back near the spine. Third, the ribs are severed from the vertebral column. Fourth, the ribs are pulled outward. Fifth, the lungs are extracted through the opening and laid over the exposed ribs to form wings. Sixth, in the Orkney version, this is offered to Odin as a sacrifice. What the sagas do not tell us is how long it took, how much the victim screamed, whether Halfdan was conscious when his lungs were pulled out, or whether anyone could actually survive long enough for the ritual to be completed. That is where the 2022 study comes in. Luke John Murphy, a historian at the University of Iceland, teamed up with Heidi Fuller and Monty Gates, medical scientists at Keele University in England, to answer a question no one had properly examined. Not whether the blood eagle happened, whether it could have happened. They used anatomical modeling software. They recreated each step of the torture on digital human bodies. They examined Viking Age tools, including swords, spears, and specialized hooks. They cross-referenced the saga descriptions with archaeological evidence of ritualized mutilation from the period. And they concluded that even the fullest version of the blood eagle, as outlined in the texts, was possible. Difficult, but possible. Here's what they found. The first step, thrusting a blade into the back by the spine, would have been straightforward for someone with anatomical knowledge. Viking Age warriors butchered animals. They understood muscle, bone, and connective tissue. The intercostal muscles between the ribs would need to be cut. The ribs attached to the vertebrae through joints called costovertebral joints. Severing those joints requires precision, but not exceptional force if you know where to cut. The study notes that a sharp blade, a steady hand, and knowledge of anatomy would make this feasible. Viking swords and sea axes, large knives that were sharp enough. Some spears had shallow hooks. Those hooks could have been used to unzip the ribs from the spine, one joint at a time. But here is the problem. Once you start cutting into the back, you are dealing with massive blood loss and potential suffocation. The pleura, the membrane surrounding the lungs, would be punctured. Air would rush into the pleural cavity, collapsing the lungs. The victim would struggle to breathe. If the cuts were too deep or too fast, the victim would die within minutes from shock or blood loss. For the ritual to work as described, the executioner would need to control the bleeding, maintain the victim's consciousness, and time each step to maximize suffering while delaying death. The study concluded that unless performed with extraordinary care, the victim would die early in the process. The lungs might never be fully extracted, the wings might never be formed, which means if the blood eagle really happened, it required someone with both surgical knowledge and sadistic precision. The sagas do not name who performed the execution on Halfdan. Some versions say Torf-Einarr did it himself. Others imply a designated official was present. The 2022 study suggests the latter is more likely. This was a public ritual. Torf-Einarr was making a statement. He was avenging his father. He was reclaiming his earldom. He was demonstrating to everyone on Orkney and everyone in Norway that if you kill an earl and burn 60 men alive, this is what happens to you. Public executions in the Viking Age were performances. They were designed to be witnessed, remembered, and feared. A blood eagle required an audience, it required time, it required preparation, and it required someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Now, let us talk about the sacrifice to Odin. The Orkney saga explicitly states that Torf-Einarr gave Halfdan to Odin for his victory. This is crucial because it connects the blood eagle to religious practice, not just revenge. Odin was the god of war, death, and wisdom. He was associated with eagles. Eagles were carrion birds. They fed on the dead left on battlefields. In skaldic poetry, the eagle is a constant symbol of slaughter. When a poet says the eagle's hunger was sated, he means men died. The eagle fed. The blood eagle, as a ritual, takes that poetic imagery and makes it literal. You become the eagle's feast. Your body becomes the offering. Your death becomes the sacrifice. But here is where it gets complicated. Not everyone believes the blood eagle ever happened. In 1984, Roberta Frank, a scholar at Yale, published a landmark analysis in the English Historical Review. The article was titled Viking Atrocity in Skaldic Verse, The Rite of the Blood Eagle. Frank argued that the whole thing was a misunderstanding. She examined every reference to the blood eagle in medieval literature. She traced how the descriptions changed over time, becoming more lurid, more detailed, more horrifying with each century. She concluded that the saga writers misunderstood skaldic poetry. The original verses, she argued, simply described leaving enemies face down on the battlefield where eagles and other scavengers would tear at their backs. The eagle was not carved into the back. The eagle carved the back with its claws. The blood eagle, in Frank's view, was a literary invention. Frank compared the blood eagle descriptions to Christian martyrdom stories. Saints were tortured in elaborate ways. Their ribs were exposed. Their organs were displayed. Frank suggested that Christian saga writers in the 13th century, living in a fully Christianized Iceland, took ambiguous skaldic verses and filled in the details with imagery borrowed from martyrdom tales. They wanted to show how brutal and pagan their ancestors were. They exaggerated. They invented. They created a ritual that never existed. For decades, Frank's interpretation dominated. Scholars cited her work. The blood eagle was dismissed as myth, but then the 2022 study came along and said, wait, let us actually test this. And what they found was that while Frank might be right about some of the embellishments, the core ritual as described in the sagas was anatomically feasible. It could have been done. And more importantly, it fit with what we know about Viking Age elite culture. The study examined so-called deviant burials from the Viking Age. These are graves where the bodies show signs of post-mortem mutilation or unusual treatment. One example is from 10th century Birka in Sweden. Archaeologists found the skeleton of a well-dressed noblewoman. She had been beheaded. Her head was placed between her arm and her torso in the grave. Her jawbone was missing, possibly destroyed during the decapitation. Someone replaced it with a pig's mandible. A pig's jawbone was placed in her skull. This was not accidental. This was deliberate. This was a message. Another example comes from mass graves associated with battles. Some bodies show perimortem trauma that goes beyond what you would expect from combat. Ribs hacked away, spines damaged, limbs removed post-mortem. The study argues that the Viking Age warrior elite had no problem displaying dead bodies in ritualized ways. They mutilated enemies. They displayed the dead as trophies. They used corpses to send messages. The blood eagle fits within that broader pattern of behavior. There's also the question of honor. Viking Age, society was obsessed with reputation. Your honor was everything. If someone killed your father in a shameful way, if they burned him alive without giving him a chance to fight, you were expected to avenge that death, and not just by killing the murderer. You were expected to make the death as humiliating and painful as possible. You were expected to turn the killer into an example. The sagas are full of revenge killings. Some involve throwing people into snake pits. Some involve burning entire families in their homes. Some involve cutting open a victim's abdomen, nailing their intestines to a post, and forcing them to walk around it until they die. That last one is called the fatal walk. It appears in sagas. It has the same dubious historicity as the blood eagle. But the point is that extreme performative violence was part of the cultural vocabulary. Halfdan Long-Leg's crime was not just murder. He had killed Rognvaldsson, Earl of Mora, a close ally and possibly a relative of the king. He had burned him alive with 60 men. He He had taken the earldom for his brother. He had then fled to Orkney, and displaced Torf-Einarr Rognvald's son. Every part of that was dishonorable. Halfdan did not challenge Rognvald to a duel. He did not meet him on a battlefield. He surrounded a house in the night and set it on fire. He killed 60 men who had no chance to defend themselves. In Viking Age terms, that was the worst kind of killing. It was nithingsverk, the work of a nothing, a man without honor. Torf-Einarr could not let that stand. If he did, he would be seen as weak. His earldom would be in jeopardy. His father's memory would be dishonored. So he hunted Halfdan down. He defeated him in battle. He captured him alive. And then he subjected him to the Blood Eagle. Whether or not the full ritual was completed, whether or not Halfdan's lungs were actually pulled out and laid over his ribs, the point was made. Torf-Einarr avenged his father. He reclaimed Orkney, and he sent a message that echoed across the North Atlantic. Cross this line, and this is what happens. After Halfdan's death, Harald Fairhair was furious, not because he loved Halfdan. The sagas make it clear that Harald had pushed Halfdan aside after his mother died, but because the manner of death was so grotesque, so public, so insulting to Harald's lineage, Harald sailed west with an army. He intended to overthrow Torf-Einarr, but Torf-Einarr did not fight. He fled to Caithness. Then he negotiated. The sagas say he offered to pay a fine. 60 gold marks. Harald demanded that the fine be levied not just on Torf-Einarr, but on all the allodial landowners of Orkney, the freeholders who owned their land outright. Torf-Einarr made a counteroffer. He would pay the entire fine himself if the landowners transferred their lands to him. They agreed. That transfer of land consolidated Torf-Einarr's control over Orkney. He became the uncontested Earl, and he founded a dynasty that controlled the islands for centuries. So Torf-Einarr won. He avenged his father. He reclaimed his earldom. He paid the fine and turned it into a consolidation of power, and all it cost was the life of a king's son, carved open on a flat island in the North Atlantic. His ribs pulled apart, his lungs spread like wings, his body given to Odin. Whether you believe the Blood Eagle was real or invented, whether you think it was a surgical ritual or a poetic metaphor turned into myth by later writers, one fact is clear. Something happened on North Ronaldsay. Halfdan Long-Leg went there alive. He did not leave. And the story of his death became so notorious, so terrifying, that it was written down centuries later in sagas compiled in Iceland, repeated in skaldic verse, debated by scholars for over 1,000 years, and examined in 2022 with anatomical software to see if it could actually be done. The answer was yes, it could. But it would take hours. It would take precision. It would take someone who knew exactly where to cut, how deep to go, how to control the bleeding, how to keep the victim conscious just long enough. And that, more than anything, is what makes the execution of Halfdan Long-Leg so terrifying. Not that it was brutal. The Viking Age was brutal. Not that it was public. Viking Age executions were public, but that it required knowledge. It required planning. It required care. You do not carve a blood eagle by accident. You do it because you want everyone who hears about it to understand what happens when you burn an earl and 60 men alive in the night. Torf-Einarr succeeded his father's position through violence. He ruled Orkney until around 910. His son, Thorfinn Torf-Einarsson, known as Thorfinn Skullsplitter, ruled after him until around 963. The dynasty Torf-Einarr founded lasted until the early 13th century. Orkney remained a Norse earldom, subject to Norway, for nearly 400 years, and it all began with a murder in Mora, a flight to Orkney, a battle on the North Atlantic, and an execution on a flat island where the wind never stops and the sea is always cold. Let us go back to the question everyone asks, did it really happen? We have two saga accounts, Orkneyinga saga from the early 1300s, Heimskringla from around 1230. Both were written centuries after the event. Both describe the Blood Eagle. Both say it happened to Halfdan. But there's another source, an earlier one, Sigvatr Thordarson, an 11th century skaldic poet, wrote a verse between 1020 and 1038. The verse is called Knutsdrapa. It mentions Ivar the Boneless having King Ella's back cut with an eagle. That is the earliest reference we have. It is not about Halfdan. It is about a different blood eagle performed on King Ella of Northumbria in 867, but it proves the term blood eagle existed in skaldic poetry before the sagas were written. Here's the problem. Skaldic verse is cryptic. It is elusive. It uses kennings, compound metaphors. When a poet says someone's back was cut with an eagle, does that mean the eagle symbol was carved into the skin? Does it mean the lungs were pulled out? Or does it mean the body was left for eagles to feed on? Roberta Frank says the last one. The 2022 study says all three might be layers of meaning that evolved over time. What we know is this. By the 13th century, when the sagas were written, the blood eagle was described in anatomical detail. The Orkney saga says the ribs were cut from the spine. The lungs were pulled out. The offering was made to Odin. Heimskringla adds that the sword was thrust into the hollow by the backbone and the ribs were cut all the way to the loins. If you value this kind of research documentary history, subscribe. Also, comment from which city you're listening to this. This second part dives into the controversy, the competing accounts, the modern forensic analysis, and what archaeology tells us about Viking Age executions. The 2022 study cites archaeological evidence from sites including Birka in Sweden, dated to the 10th century, and deviant burials across Scandinavia and the British Isles that show perimortem and postmortem mutilation consistent with ritualized violence. Now, back to it. There is no archaeological evidence of a blood eagle victim. No skeleton has been found with ribs severed from the spine in the pattern the sagas describe. But that does not mean it did not happen. Soft tissue does not survive. Lungs decompose. If someone's ribs were cut away and the lungs removed, what you would find is a skeleton with missing or damaged ribs, and there are Viking Age graves with exactly that. Ribs hacked off, spines damaged, trauma that goes beyond battlefield injuries. The question is intent. Were those injuries inflicted as part of a ritual, or were they just the result of brutal combat followed by scavenging animals? The 2022 study examined this. They looked at skeletal remains from mass graves, deviant burials, and execution sites. They found patterns. Some bodies show signs of deliberate post-mortem display, heads placed in unusual positions, limbs arranged, bodies buried face down, which in Viking Age culture was a mark of shame. One burial from 10th century Birka shows a woman beheaded, her head placed between her arm and torso, her jawbone replaced with a pig's mandible. That is not random. That is symbolic. Someone wanted to humiliate her even in death. The study argues that the blood eagle, if performed, would fit into this category of performative post-mortem violence. Now let us talk about Torf-Einarr. The sagas describe him as tall, ugly, blind in one eye, and sharp-sighted nonetheless. That one eye detail is significant. Odin had one eye. He sacrificed the other for wisdom. Torf-Einarr's nickname, Torf or turf, comes from the fact that he burned turf or peat for warmth in Orkney due to a shortage of wood. The islands had little timber. Peat was the fuel source. Torf-Einarr made it work. He adapted. He survived. And he avenged his father in a way that became legendary. But there is another layer to this. Torf-Einarr was a poet. The sagas say he composed verses about his feud with Halfdan Long-Leg. Those verses are now lost. Only fragments survive in the Landnámabók, a medieval Icelandic text about the settlement of Iceland. But the fact that Torf-Einarr wrote poetry about his revenge means the story was told and retold in his own lifetime. It was not just a later invention, it was part of the oral tradition from the start, and in a culture where poets served kings and earls, where verses were performed at feasts and remembered for generations, a story like the Blood Eagle would have been unforgettable. The Historia Norvegiae, a Latin text from around 1220, also mentions Halfdan's death. It says he was killed by the Orkney Islanders. It does not specify the method. That silence is interesting. If the Blood Eagle was widely known in the 12th and 13th centuries, why does the Historia not mention it? Some scholars argue this proves it was a later embellishment. Others argue the Historia was simply less interested in the gruesome details. It was a history, not a saga. It cared about who ruled, who died, who succeeded. The how was secondary. The debate comes down to this. Do we trust the sagas? They were written 300 years after the events. They drew on oral tradition, skaldic verse, and earlier texts that are now lost. They were compiled in Christian Iceland by writers who had never seen a blood eagle, who lived in a society that had converted to Christianity 2 centuries earlier, who might have been influenced by Christian martyrdom stories. Or do we look at the consistency of the accounts, the anatomical detail, the cultural context, and conclude that something like the blood eagle probably happened, even if the descriptions were embellished over time? The 2022 study takes a middle position. They do not claim the blood eagle definitely happened. They claim it could have happened. The anatomy works. The tools were available. The cultural context supports it. And the saga descriptions, while sensational, are not anatomically impossible. That matters because, for most of the 20th century, the scholarly consensus was that the blood eagle was pure fiction. Roberta Frank's 1984 article was influential. She made a strong case, but the 2022 study used methods Frank did not have access to. Anatomical modeling software, detailed forensic analysis, cross-referencing with archaeological evidence of ritualized violence. And their conclusion was different. Now let us talk about the tools. What would you use to perform a blood eagle? The sagas mention swords. Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla says Torf-Einarr thrust a sword into Halfdan's backbone. But swords are not ideal for this kind of precision work. They are long. They are heavy. They are designed for slashing and stabbing in combat, not for surgical cuts. The 2022 study suggests other tools might have been used. Sea axes, large knives common in the Viking Age, would work better. They are sharp, maneuverable, and designed for close work. Butchering knives, used for animals, would also be suitable. And then there are the spears with hooks. Viking Age spears came in many forms. Some had broad blades, some had narrow points, some had small hooks or barbs near the tip. Those hooks were designed to catch on shields or pull an enemy off balance, but they could also be used to hook ribs. The 2022 study notes that if you wanted to separate ribs from the spine without cutting through bone, you could use a hooked blade to slip under each rib and pull it away from the costovertebral joint. That would be faster and cleaner than hacking with a sword. And it would explain the phrase in the sagas about cutting the ribs from the spine. You are not sawing through bone. You are severing connective tissue and cartilage. The study tested this with anatomical software. They modeled the human thorax, the rib cage. They identified the attachment points. They simulated different cutting angles. And they found that with the right tool and the right knowledge, you could detach all 12 pairs of ribs on both sides in a matter of minutes. The victim would still be alive at that point, assuming you controlled the bleeding and did not puncture major blood vessels, but the pain would be unimaginable. The ribs protect the lungs and heart. Once they are gone, the chest cavity is exposed. The lungs would collapse. The victim would struggle to breathe, and that brings us to the lungs. Pulling the lungs out through the back is the most controversial part of the blood eagle, and the sagas say it was done. The Orkney saga specifies that the lungs were pulled out and laid over the exposed ribs. Heimskringla is less detailed, but confirms the lungs were removed. The 2022 study examined whether this is anatomically possible, and the answer is yes, but barely. The lungs are large. Spongy organs. They fill most of the chest cavity. They are attached to the trachea, the windpipe, and surrounded by the pleura, thin membranes. If you have already detached the ribs and opened the back, you could reach in and pull the lungs through. But here is the problem. The lungs need to stay intact for the wings to form. If they tear, they deflate. If they deflate, there are no wings. You just have a bloody mess. The study concludes that pulling the lungs out would require extreme care. You would need to cut the attachments at the trachea without tearing the lung tissue. You would need to maneuver the lungs through the opening in the back without rupturing them, and you would need to do all of this while the victim is still alive, or at least freshly dead. If too much time passes, rigor mortis sets in and the tissue becomes rigid. So the blood eagle, if performed as described, would need to be done quickly and precisely. That level of precision suggests either exceptional anatomical knowledge or prior practice, or both. Now let us talk about pain. Could Halfdan have been conscious during any of this? The sagas do not say, but the 2022 study examined the neurological aspects. When you cut into the back, you sever nerves. The intercostal nerves run between the ribs. Cutting those nerves would cause immediate, searing pain, but it would also start to numb the surrounding tissue. Shock would set in. Blood loss would cause the blood pressure to drop. The brain would start to shut down non-essential functions. Within minutes, the victim might lose consciousness, but not immediately. For the first few cuts, for the first few ribs pulled away, the victim would feel everything. The study notes that if the executioner wanted to maximize suffering, they would need to work fast enough to complete the ritual before shock caused unconsciousness, but slow enough to make sure the victim experienced as much pain as possible. That window is narrow, maybe 10 to 15 minutes, maybe less. The blood loss is the biggest challenge. When you cut into the back near the spine, you risk severing major blood vessels. The aorta runs down the left side of the spine. The vena cava runs down the right side. These are the largest blood vessels in the body. If either one is cut, the victim bleeds out in seconds. But there are smaller vessels too. The intercostal arteries run between the ribs. Cutting those would cause significant bleeding but not instant death. The study concludes that a skilled executioner could avoid the major vessels by staying lateral, cutting away from the spine rather than toward it. But even with perfect technique, the blood loss would be massive. The victim would go into hypovolemic shock, a condition where the body does not have enough blood to function. The heart would race. The breathing would become rapid and shallow. The skin would turn pale and cold. And eventually, the organs would start to fail. The lungs are especially vulnerable. Once the pleura is punctured and air enters the chest cavity, the lungs collapse. This is called a pneumothorax. It makes breathing extremely difficult. The victim would gasp, struggle, feel like they were drowning. If both lungs collapsed, death would follow within minutes. The study notes that for the blood eagle to work as described, the executioner would need to keep at least one lung partially functional until the very end. That means controlling how much air enters the chest cavity, possibly by covering the wounds with cloth or leather to create a seal. This level of care, this level of knowledge, suggests that the blood eagle was not improvised. It was planned, it was rehearsed, or at least performed by someone who understood human anatomy in the same way a butcher understands animal anatomy. Viking Age society had that knowledge. They butchered cattle, pigs, sheep. They prepared meat for storage. They tanned hides. They knew where to cut to separate ribs from the spine. They knew how to remove organs without tearing them. The skill set required for the blood eagle overlaps significantly with the skill set required for butchering large animals. The 2022 study draws this connection explicitly. They argue that in a society where most people participated in animal slaughter, where warriors often had to field dress their own kills, the anatomical knowledge needed for the blood eagle would not have been rare or specialized. It would have been common. But knowing how to do something and actually doing it are different. The blood eagle crosses a line. It takes knowledge meant for animals and applies it to humans. It turns a person into a carcass while they are still alive. And it does so publicly, as a performance as a demonstration of power. That psychological dimension is important. The blood eagle was not just about killing Halfdan. It was about making his death a spectacle. It was about showing everyone watching what happens when you violate the social order. You burn an Earl and 60 men alive in the night. You get carved open like a sacrifice in the daylight. The sagas say the blood eagle was offered to Odin. That religious element has been debated. Was it a genuine sacrifice? Or was that detail added later by Christian writers trying to make their pagan ancestors look more barbaric? The 2022 study examines this question through the lens of Viking Age religion. Odin was the god of war, death, and wisdom. He hung himself on the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days to gain knowledge of the runes. He sacrificed himself to himself. Human sacrifice to Odin is attested in other sources. Adam of Bremen, an 11th century chronicler, describes a temple at Uppsala in Sweden where human sacrifices were hung every 9 years. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab traveler who visited the Volga region in 922, describes a Viking funeral where a slave woman was killed and placed in a ship with her dead master. These are not saga accounts. These are external sources from people who witnessed or heard about Viking practices firsthand. So human sacrifice was part of Viking Age religious practice. The question is whether the blood eagle was a form of sacrifice or a form of execution that was later framed as a sacrifice by the saga writers. The 2022 study argues both could be true. Executions and sacrifices were not always distinct categories. Killing a captive to honor a god could be both an execution and a sacrifice. The fact that the Orkney saga says Torf-Einarr gave Halfdan to Odin for his victory suggests the ritual had religious significance, at least in the minds of the people telling the story. There's also the eagle symbolism. Eagles in Norse mythology are associated with Odin. An eagle sits at the top of Yggdrasil, the world tree. Another eagle, or possibly the same one, is said to create the winds by flapping its wings. Eagles are carrion birds. They feed on the dead. They are omens of battle and death. In skaldic poetry, when a warrior dies, the eagle's hunger is sated. The raven and the wolf also appear in this context. They are the beasts of battle. They follow armies. They feast on corpses. The blood eagle takes this imagery and literalizes it. The victim becomes the eagle's meal. The body becomes the offering. The death becomes the symbol. But there's another interpretation. Some scholars argue the blood eagle was not a religious ritual at all. It was political theater. It was a way for Torf-Einarr to demonstrate his power and legitimacy. He had been displaced from Orkney by Halfdan. He had fled to Caithness. He had fought his way back. And now he needed to prove he was in control. Executing Halfdan in a spectacular, memorable way accomplished that. It sent a message to Harald Fairhair in Norway. It sent a message to the people of Orkney. It sent a message to anyone who might challenge Torf-Einarr's authority in the future. The religious framing, the offering to Odin, could have been a way to justify the brutality. We are not just killing him, we are sacrificing him. We are honoring the gods. We are doing what the gods demand. The 2022 study does not pick sides on this. They note that religion and politics were deeply intertwined in Viking Age society. A ritual could be both religious and political. A sacrifice could be both an offering to the gods and a demonstration of power. The blood eagle, if it happened, was probably all of these things at once. It was revenge for Rognvald's death. It was a reclaiming of Torf-Einarr's earldom. It was a sacrifice to Odin. And it was a message to everyone watching. After Halfdan's execution, Harald Fairhair sailed west with an army. He was furious. The sagas say he intended to overthrow Torf-Einarr and punish him for killing a king's son. But Torf-Einarr did not fight. He fled to Caithness again, then he negotiated. He sent envoys to Harold. He offered to pay a fine, 60 gold marks. That number is significant. Rognvald had been killed with 60 men, 60 marks for 60 deaths. Whether that symmetry was intentional or coincidental, the sagas do not say. But Harold accepted the offer with a condition. The fine would not be paid by Torf-Einarr alone. It would be levied on all the allodial landowners of Orkney. Allodial land was land owned outright, not held in fief from a lord. The landowners of Orkney were freeholders. They had rights, they had independence. Harold's demand put them in a difficult position. If they paid the fine, they would be acknowledging Harold's authority over Orkney. If they refused, they would face the wrath of a Norwegian king who had just lost a son. Torf-Einarr made them an offer. He would pay the entire fine himself, all 60 marks, if the landowners transferred their lands to him. They agreed, and with that agreement, Torf-Einarr consolidated his control over Orkney. He went from being a displaced earl to the unchallenged ruler of the islands. He turned his father's murder, Halfdan's execution, and Harold's demand for a fine into a political victory. That is the end of Halfdan's story. He died on North Ronaldsay. His body was left there, or possibly taken elsewhere for burial. The sagas do not say. What they do say is that his death was remembered. It was written down in the Orkneyinga saga in the early 1300s, almost 400 years later. It was referenced in Heimskringla. It was debated by scholars in the 20th and 21st centuries, and in 2022, a team of medical scientists and a historian sat down with anatomical software and asked whether the whole thing could have actually happened. The answer was yes, but here is the final twist. Even if the blood eagle was performed exactly as the sagas describe, even if Halfdan's ribs were cut away and his lungs pulled out and his body offered to Odin, we will never know for certain. No skeleton has been found with a specific pattern of injuries. No contemporary account exists. The earliest written references are from centuries later. All we have are the sagas, the skaldic verses, and the cultural context, and that ambiguity is part of what makes the blood eagle so enduring. It sits on the edge of history and myth. It is plausible enough to be real, horrifying enough to be unforgettable, and ambiguous enough to be debated forever. What we do know is this. Halfdan Long-Leg killed Rognvald Eysteinn by burning him alive with 60 men. He took the earldom of Mura for his brother. He fled to Orkney. He displaced Torf-Einarr. Torf-Einarr fought back, defeated Halfdan in battle, hunted him down on North Ronaldsay, and executed him in a manner so brutal that it became legendary. Whether that execution was the blood eagle as described in the sagas, or something less elaborate that was later exaggerated, the fact remains that Halfdan died in disgrace. His body was used to send a message, and Torf-Einarr founded a dynasty that ruled Orkney for over 3 centuries. In 2022, the speculum study concluded with this observation. The blood eagle, if performed, would have been part of a continuum of ritualized violence in Viking Age elite culture. It was not an isolated act of random brutality. It was a response to a specific kind of killing, what the study calls a bad death. Rognvald was burned alive without a chance to fight. That was shameful. That was dishonorable. And in a society where honor mattered more than life, that kind of death demanded a response. The blood eagle was that response. It reclaimed the honor that had been lost. It turned the killer into a sacrifice. It made the body into a warning. And that is what makes the execution of Halfdan Long-Leg more terrifying than you imagined. Not because it was brutal, not because it was public, but because it was calculated. It was planned. It required knowledge, precision, and time. It was designed not just to kill, but to transform death into a message that would echo across generations. And whether it happened exactly as the sagas describe, or was embellished over centuries of retelling, the story achieved its purpose. 900 years later, we are still talking about it. We are still trying to understand it. We are still asking whether human beings could actually do this to each other. And the answer, according to the best anatomical and historical evidence we have, is yes. They could, and on a flat island north of Scotland in the late 9th century, they probably did.